old city neighborhood, by the sidewalks that actually went somewhere out front. You walked on that sidewalk to a nearby city bus or streetcar stop. You went to school or worship. You shopped at the nearby mom and pop grocery store, or you ate or drank at the neighborhood diner or pub. If you walked a little further on that sidewalk, you came to a larger old-fashioned shopping area, sometimes at the intersection of transit lines, where there was likely a chain supermarket, a drugstore, a department store, a variety store, a branch post office, medical offices, and most importantly, a neighborhood movie theater. Now, most of the homes in the old neighborhood had some kind of arrangement for sitting outside, whether on the front stoop or the side yard. A lot of living occurred out there. On anything like a warm day, old and young sat out to pass the time or just wind down. And many of the neighborhoods had an alley out back, which served as a shortcut, a place to play, and access to the garage or the place where the garbage was picked up. Now, World War II, which for the United States lasted from 1941 to 1945, was a watershed event for the American home front, bringing neighborhoods and neighbors closer together for a desperate common purpose and influencing startling changes over the next decades in community life. On almost every block in the neighborhood, banners hung in the front window of the home to announce that a close family member had gone off to war. A blue star denoted active service, and a gold one was a sad reminder that a family member had paid the ultimate sacrifice. A nighttime air raid drill in the neighborhood brought everyone to understand the true meaning of lights out. A neighbor volunteer for the Civilian Defense Corps would issue a stern warning if all the lights hadn't been turned off, your curtains drawn, your shades pulled, and blinds closed. Also during World War II, neighbors pitched in to help the war effort by purchasing victory stamps of varying denominations at school and work. You could fill up a book with 187 red 10-cent stamps, each emblazoned with an armed Revolutionary War Minuteman. You added a nickel to your $18.70 purchase and turned the stamp book in to receive a $25 war savings bond redeemable in 10 years. Billboards proclaimed, "You buy 'em and we'll fly 'em," meaning warplanes. Also in the neighborhood, victory gardens were planted at both the schoolyard and on plots in the neighborhood to supplement scarce food supply, and some of that harvest was canned for winter use. That local World War II pitch-in mentality made every citizen a recycler. Public campaigns called for donations of kitchen grease, scrap metal, newspapers, old tires, and some folks even helped by saving the silver foil off chewing gum wrappers and cigarette packs. Media campaigns preached against waste of any kind. Now, a giant federal bureaucracy called the Office of Price Administration reached the federal government's arm into every household in the neighborhood. To control inflation and profiteering and scarcity, the OPA issued ration stamps that told each family how many gallons of gasoline and sets of tires they could buy, how many pounds of sugar and coffee, how many pairs of shoes, and how much the corner grocer could charge for a can of beans. Citizens also were required to limit their consumption of meat. The feds even told Mama the maximum rent she could charge for renting out an extra bedroom to a war worker in the community. Now, America emerged from that World War II wealthier, in love with new technologies, and at least a little more conscious of citizens who had been denied full participation in the American dream. Societal change was likely brewing anyway, but the war sped things up by calling us to self-examination of some of our most oppressive ways. If you look carefully at the slide that's on the screen, in the left-hand corner, you can see the sign reads in the bus station, waiting room, colored waiting room. So that's the kind of oppression that we're talking about. But it wasn't long, for instance, until federal courts nullified the restrictive covenants written into many property deeds that forbade, by law, a person of African or Hebrew descent from being able to live in certain neighborhoods. And over the next decades, the walls of racial segregation in schools, parks, housing, libraries, and businesses fell one by one. Integration, however, did not magically level the racial playing field, and we're still living with the effects of a more subtle and vicious form of systemic racism. Now, throughout the 1950s, and this is really pretty late, many local newspapers continued to accept want ads that were divided by race until the passage of a tough U.S. civil rights law in 1964. The Louisville Courier-Journal, for instance, listed jobs and housing opportunities in separate columns, a column for whites and a column for blacks. Now, despite World War II's iconic woman factory worker, you know her, Rosie the Riveter, opportunities for women remained restricted. Before the war, some school districts fired women teachers for getting married, and until well into the 1950s, young female nursing students could be expelled for the very same offense. They got married. In addition to that, our local daily newspaper persisted in separating jobs by gender well into the mid-1960s. And I promise you, many of our daughters and granddaughters are now in positions that would have not made that traditional jobs for women list. Well, it's hard to believe. Until 1970 in Kentucky, a woman could not stand on either side of the bar, and I don't mean the bar of justice. A female was not allowed to tend bar in a tavern, nor could she be a sitting or standing patron at that bar. Simply put, both food and drink had to be served together for a woman to either wait the table in a tavern or to be a customer there. Now, community attitudes changed slowly. You're talking about changes now in that era after World War II. Those community attitudes toward persons with disabilities, physical disabilities, began to change very slowly. A weak 1968 federal law made us more aware of the limits that our physically challenged neighbors face. After the law was strengthened in the early 1990s, wider automatic doors, ramps to the entrance, and wide John stalls with bars on the side to lower yourself to the toilet seat clearly made it easier for those of our friends and family on walkers and in chairs. In our own time, that post-World War II energy for giving marginalized citizens a fair shake has enabled our gay and hopefully trans friends to live more openly and honestly. Now, you're talking about change. Get this, and this is really hard to get a hold of. In Louisville, for instance, and I don't think we were that unique as an urban community, until 1958, every time you flushed the toilet, it flowed directly into the Ohio River untreated. And until 1970, there was a fall ritual in all communities whereby we all raked our leaves to the street and we burned them outside in front of the house. That was before public health officials decided that we all had asthma and allergies. And did you ever wonder why there are so many squirrels in your neighborhood? It's a speculative, but I believe it's true. It's because for almost 30 years, our city has had a generally respected leash law that keeps Fido from at least occasionally grabbing a squirrel before it gets up the tree. Later, though, our community passed a pooper scooper law that isn't worth the paper it's printed on. The government officer charged with enforcement must see the offending animal in the act before a citation can be issued. Dramatic change occurred in other aspects of community life. Before World War II, at death, many families had visitations occurring in the home with the dead body in the front room, laid out in the front room. But soon after World War II, the funeral parlor became more popular and replaced the front parlor for laying out the dead. And during my childhood, now this is a personal example, at least at the racially segregated white downtown YMCA in Louisville, whether you were a rich man or a poor kid, if you wanted to swim in the indoor swimming pool at the downtown YMCA, you were required to leave your bathing suit in the locker. Yeah, you got it. Only skinny dipping at the white downtown YMCA. Now consider this change in the era after World War II in popular media. Oh, how soon we forget. In 1970, the U.S. Congress forbade all cigarette advertising from the airwaves. As a result, you could no longer see or hear Johnny Roventini, the grown man with a pituitary condition that kept him small with a high-pitched voice. An ad agency dressed him up as a hotel bellhop as he called for Philip. Further, by the same congressional mandate, the words throat hot, smoke cools, not a cough in the carload. And LSMFT stands for Lucky Strike, means fine tobacco. Those words, those phrases could not be heard on the airwaves. Interestingly, though, while cigarettes were driven from radio and TV, there was no attempt to ban beer ads, the money from which today even remains the very lifeblood of many big-time sports. Now, back in the old city neighborhood, in addition to all the residents, you remember, that used that sidewalk out front to go somewhere, the same sidewalk was an avenue for bringing in regular visitors. For instance, until 1950, the mail carrier came to your house 2 times each day. Or until Valentine's Day, 1987, here in Louisville, with the demise of our evening paper, newspapers were delivered twice daily, morning paper, evening paper, with the newspaper carrier returning on Saturday morning to collect on the bill. Early each day, the clippity-clop of horse-drawn green and yellow Donaldson's wagon delivering fresh bakery goods was heard out in front of the house. The last 28 Donaldson's Old Dobbins were put to pasture in the spring of 1949, and the panel truck replacements just didn't carry the same romance. And the street quiet was also broken long before breakfast by the hooves of a horse-drawn milk wagon, fresh milk in a returnable bottle with cream standing tall on top and sealed with a cardboard cap with a little tab was left in the insulated dairy box out on the side porch. Produce vendors came down the sidewalk or street into the neighborhood calling, "Strawberries, strawberries," came down. And on the weekend, county farmers in an open bed pickup truck with a swinging scale attached to the back hawked fresh vegetables, eggs, and dressed chickens. And out front, an ice cream cart was pushed or pedaled down the street. And in some cases, a dappled Shetland pony came down the street as well, led by a photographer, ready to sit beau and sis up on the saddle for a prize photo to be given as a gift to mom and pap. And on some sidewalks, not mine, but some sidewalks, an organ grinder came by, cranking out music in exchange for a coin tossed into the hat extended by a leashed monkey. In the alley out back, a ragman commanded his horse from high aboard his rickety-wheeled wagon. Now, in northern cities, the ragman frequently hailed as an immigrant from Eastern Europe, while in the South, that ragman was usually black. He collected commodities like newspapers and rags and negotiated at the alley side for scrap metal. You know what I call the ragman? The first formal recycling operator. A little later, coming down that same alley, the garbage dump truck came, a sanitation worker wearing rubber waders, piling raw garbage to the back of the dump truck and ultimately heading to the city dump. And I don't mean the landfill. Also coming down the sidewalk, Watkins, Jewel Tea, and Fuller Brush salespeople were joined knocking at the front door by the Avon makeup lady or a blind mop and broom peddler. They were joined by vacuum cleaner, Bible, and encyclopedia salespeople, also joining the weekly debit insurance agent who collected at the front door a dime or quarter from mama as a premium on a $1,000 life insurance policy. In some neighborhoods, scissors and knife sharpeners with a grinding wheel attached to a wagon or truck stopped by. And each summer, a yo-yo salesman came to teach a new batch of children how to perform the dog, rock the baby, or around the world, a new yo-yo trick. In many neighborhoods in the 1940s and into the 1950s, the Iceman truly did cometh, wielding a chunk of block ice grappled by giant tongs pitched up on leather-draped shoulder. A sign in the front window of the house told the Iceman how many pounds of ice to put in the icebox. Talking about change in the old neighborhood, things sure used to be different inside the house. For instance, Monday used to be wash day. You wash the clothes in a tub washer with a wringer attached. You may have to refill it with clear water in order to rinse the clothes. And then you hung the clothes to dry with wooden clothespins on a backyard line. You brought them in to iron once dried, damping them slightly with a water-filled Coke bottle corked with a sprinkler top. Oh, you weren't ready to iron after sprinkling the clothes? Then you would roll them up damp and put them in the refrigerator until you were ready to iron. On bitterly cold mornings in the neighborhood, The sharp stench in the air told you that almost every household in the neighborhood heated their homes by burning coal. That meant that regardless of one's station in life, rich or poor, you had to figure out the same thing. What are you going to do with the clinkers, the cinders, and the ashes? And because of that cold soot, most households face the same springtime challenge: cleaning the wallpaper with a spongy pink glob that reminded you of Play-Doh. Now, in the summer in the old neighborhood, there was no air conditioning. So the screens are in the window and the screens are in the door. That meant that the sounds and smells of inside the house mingled freely with the outside. In the neighborhood, you heard the shrill factory whistles signaling breaks and shift changes at nearby breweries and distilleries and packing houses and tobacco works. And the stench told you that when those factories were really cooking. From the sidewalk, you knew that city sidewalk out front. You knew which families were Roman Catholic because you could hear the radio rosary of the air through the front screen door at supper time. And it wasn't hard to know which families had liver and onions for supper. With the houses so close together in the neighborhood, families had to argue in muted tones, or the dispute from inside could trail out to become a community dispute outside. With some pride in the old neighborhood home, you had a phone in the house, but most folks shared it with a couple of other families on a party line where you memorized your specific ring. Long, long, short, or possibly short, short, long. When you wanted to make a call, you could wait and wait for a neighbor to get off the line. And even then, you could tell by the click that they had picked up the receiver to eavesdrop on every word you said. Whether a straight line or a party line phone, an operator's actual voice always said when you picked up the phone, "Number, please." The yards in the neighborhood were a lot smaller, which meant you didn't need to start an engine to cut the grass. A rotary push mower sufficed for most people. Now, come on inside the kitchen of the house. Let's look around. At my house, I used to be called the Tupperware King because I frequently got home late, ate after the family had finished, and was left in charge of putting the leftovers away. My wife, having left the kitchen, compulsively called back, "What'd you do with the leftover broccoli?" "Oh, I put it in Tupperware and put it in the ice box." At that moment, my spouse, having taken instant offense, returned to the kitchen. "Ice box," she exclaimed. "My family had an ice box, but your family was better off financially and they had a refrigerator." And my wife would say, "Oh man, you need to remember that difference." I sure hope those of you out there in Cyberland know the difference between an icebox and a refrigerator. Oh, did you stop at the grocery to buy the oleomargarine? Until 1950, both state and federal law required you to buy margarine in an ugly, lifeless lump. At home, you painted that grayish-colored oleo glob an appetizing yellow by popping 2 red vegetable dye pills into a cellophane bag and squeezing and squishing them together until you painted your ugly oleomargarine a edible yellow. Why is this? The nation's dairy farmers had their boot on the legislators' necks to force you to buy the ugliest butter substitute possible. And oh, back then, you also bought soft drinks in returnable bottles, sealed with a cork-lined metal cap. And do you remember, or you can find old people who will tell you, that all Coca-Cola bottles had the name of the city embossed in the underneath glass on the bottom where that bottle was first filled, where the Coca-Cola bottling works was located. Now, in the old neighborhood, I know you got pests just like you do now. You don't need an aerosol can full of chemicals to eliminate crawling and flying insects in the kitchen. You simply whacked them with a fly swatter or caught them on sticky fly paper. And I swear, the double sink in the kitchen is mostly a modern invention. Most folks wash their dishes in a single sink, rinse them under cold water, and stack them in a drain rack to drip dry. So what's a dish towel for? Simply to wipe away the last dull spots on the mostly dry dishes. And Mama, she had a nice tablecloth on her dining room table, but I'll bet you she covered the kitchen table with an oilcloth to make it easier to sop up spills from Bo and Sis. Now, in many neighborhoods, there was a mom and pop grocery store on almost every corner. The meat case, with its butcher block behind, dominated that scene. The butcher's plank-floored workspace was covered with sawdust to soak up the blood and grease spills, and a large roll of coated paper sat atop the case for wrapping meat with minimal leakage. Now, do you know there were the corner grocery stores, but they were different than the cash and carry chain store rivals. You know what the difference was between a neighborhood grocery store and a chain store in the neighborhood? Purchases at the neighborhood store were enumerated on a pad with a carbon copy to the customer and the other put in an alphabetical file. In other words, there was credit at that store. On Friday night, when Bo and Sis came to pay on the grocery bill, the grocer rewarded them with a piece of candy. Out front of the corner grocery store, there was a large green bread box, which served as a seat for older kids to watch the world go by. Now, in the 1950s, S&H green or yellow top value stamps were given with purchases at almost all stores. Virtually everyone maneuvered to fill books with hundreds of stamps that could be redeemed at the premium store. My uncle, now this is a weird story, my uncle was an undertaker, and he swore he got a new hearse with trading stamps earned on purchases of embalming fluid. In those days, look, no credit cards. You wanted something really badly, you put it on layaway, and you took it home from the store after you paid for it in full. In many neighborhoods, corner taverns were almost as ubiquitous as grocery stores. A giant jar of pickled pig's feet sat atop the long bar, and most taverns featured sandwich fixings and a lunch serving table. Neighborhood bars were occasionally a public nuisance, but happily, a drunk neighbor, stumbling on the way home on the sidewalk was a much better option than driving the wrong way on the expressway. Now, I know it's hard to believe, but until the early 1970s, most stores were required by state law to be closed on Sundays. There have been many big changes in health and personal hygiene since World War II as well. Maybe this was just aimed at me and my scruffy classmates at school, but we were subjected to a weekly health inspection in our classroom. Each student was paraded in front of the teacher, who was standing in front of a well-lighted window. And before her scrutinizing eyes, you stretched your eyelids down for her to look for styes. You opened wide for her to check for a sore throat. You tilted your head for her to see if there were any ear jams or any ear wax, and leaned your head forward for a cootie inspection there in the classroom. And can you imagine, in the days after World War II, doctors used to make house calls. Also, my brother and I, and this is pure mythology, didn't need a doctor to help us negotiate the dangers of catching dreaded polio. My grandmother had a scheme. She insisted that we be armed against the crippler by wearing a string around our necks attached to a small bag filled with an herbal mixture called aspidity. After a few days of summer heat, that concoction in the bag stunk so badly that no kid in the neighborhood would get near us. Also, by the way, in the old neighborhood, all I can say is we didn't get polio, but I think there were probably other factors, substantial factors as well. Also, in the old neighborhood, you knew who along the street had a contagious disease because a color-coded quarantine sign was hung in the front window of your home by the health department to warn that typhoid, scarlet fever, or measles was being experienced in the home. Now, in those days, there was no sunscreen, only suntan oil. And toward the end of World War II, penicillin began to be widely used to combat infections. Toothpaste came in soft metal tubes with a key to squeeze out the last bit of ooze. And you know, I understood most items on Mama's dressing table. I had bobby pins, powder puffs, but I swear I never made sense of 5-day deodorant pads. I knew it was a mouthful of fillings that caused the alarm, and I was a little hurt when I was in the dentist office, and because I was from a young progressive, I lived in a young progressive community that armed me against decay by adding fluoride to the water. But the dentist looked at my mouth when I was an adult and said, too late, too late. Later, I found out that Louisville's decay fighting program didn't begin until 1951, which I was in my early adolescence. Much too late for me to receive the full benefit of the fluoride additive. And consider the classroom at the old neighborhood school. Your school desk had an inkwell, in all likelihood, though you may have been using a newfangled ballpoint pen, and most classrooms had a separate space, even a little room off the main classroom for hanging your cloak. It's called a cloakroom, even if you didn't have a cloak. Was it punishment or honor to get to beat the chalk dust out of the erasers and wipe the blackboard clean? Yes, in those days, there was a Bible reading in the public school. But at my school, Presumably in deference to the large number of Jewish kids, we only read Old Testament text. And just as now, the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag was recited daily, but without the "under God" phrase in the pledge. Those words, "under God," were added in 1954 by President Eisenhower and Congress to make sure religious America was contrasted with our godless communist adversaries in the Cold War. Movies and radio were the popular entertainments of the day in the old neighborhood. In Louisville, there were 24 neighborhood theaters, movie theaters, not counting those in the racially segregated Old Walnut Commercial District or the big segregated movie palaces downtown. And what a bargain the neighborhood movie theater was. A single ticket got you two full-length movies, a cartoon, a newsreel, adventure serial, and coming attractions. But best of all, those movie houses boasted continuous showings, which meant on weekends you could keep your seat in the darkened movie theater from noon to midnight. Now, in Louisville in 1947, there were 4 radio stations, all of them at AM. A review of afternoon programming on one station alone was revealing. From 2 to 5 p.m., a homemaker, if they chose, could listen to a regimen of 12 back-to-back emotionally charged radio soap operas, each 15 minutes long, a daily menu of Backstage Wife, Lorenzo Jones, Life Beautiful, Portia Faces Life, and much, much more could leave the listener limp as a noodle just before supper time. Now, kids in the old neighborhood spent most of their time outdoors. They had an instinct for turning every postage stamp piece of ground into a sports field. The slightest side yard became a football gridiron. The street became a baseball diamond or roller rink. A hoop attached to a garage made a basketball court, and the alley a field for playing tin can alley or kick the can. The ubiquitous sidewalk out front, we mentioned it earlier, was a stage for playing Mother May I, My Father Owns a Grocery Store, or Lemonade. And at night, the whole neighborhood was transformed into a maneuvering ground for playing catchers or capture the flag. A lawn of white-top clover provided the ingredients for making a short-lived chain that was tied to a car bumper, and a steady breeze in the neighborhood called for lofting a kite between the electric wires. In the old neighborhood, the bicycle was both a liberator and a business tool for kids. The bike allowed a young person to pedal beyond the confines of the home turf, transforming a whole end of the city into a discovery zone and a potential job site. Corner grocery and drugstores hired kids to make home deliveries on bikes, and others earned extra money delivering newspapers while on the move. Now, the night before Thanksgiving, 1948, WAVE TV brought television to Louisville with implications for neighborhood life that were unfathomable. The station beamed its first remote broadcast the next day by airing the annual Mayo Manual Football Classic. In the first year alone, television programming was almost exclusively local, unless it was on what they called CinemaScope, and available only in the evening, of course, no daytime television. and of course in black and white. 16 months later, rival WHS TV went on the air, and that first day, Randy Atcher and Tom Brooks launched their popular T-Bar V children's program. Now, in the old neighborhood, the landscape was transformed almost overnight in the late 1940s by rooftops capped with spindly aluminum television antenna, and slowly but inexorably, with the dawning of the television era, the retreat to the inside of the home began. I think if you had a snapshot of the old neighborhood, you would be shocked that there were so few cars parked at the curb. Remember, city neighborhoods developed along streetcar or bus lines, and a goodly number of people rode public transit. It wasn't unusual then to see a newspaper ad advertising for a sale of a house or the rental of an apartment that boasted in the ad, "This property is on a car line," which means a transit line. Oh, did you go with mom and dad to the filling station? An attendant filled the car tank, washed the windshield, added air to the tires lined with inner tubes, and routinely checked the oil in the crankcase. As the gasoline was being pumped, children delighted in watching the orange-colored penny wheel turn as the gasoline was put in the car. Now, our journey back to the old neighborhood suggests several broad generalizations. Most of us have given up the front porch sit and retreated behind closed doors into year-round climate-controlled living space with the television and computer center at the rear of the house. With the auto as king, residents have abandoned using the sidewalk to get somewhere, and that decline of liveliness out in front of the house has further exacerbated by fewer neighborhood visitors coming down the street. So there are few people outside on the sidewalk. In today's world, we're startled when someone knocks on our front door. In too many neighborhoods, we've left the sidewalk to the vulnerable and those that would prey on them, with little evidence that the street out front belongs to the residents of the neighborhood. No wonder our communities, at least in our minds, just don't feel as safe anymore. While community life was often stronger in the old neighborhood, I have not described, and please understand, the good old days. Many of our neighbors faced harsh physical and social barriers that kept them from reaching their potential. And routine chores consume too much time, and it's much easier to get things done now. And while healthcare is unfortunately more impersonal, modern medicines and public health advances have clearly extended our quality of life. Now look, while there is no returning to the old neighborhood, there are, I think, enduring values to be gleaned from those earlier days. For instance, here's an example. I challenge you to sit out in front of your house 3 times this summer, even if it means dragging a dining room chair out to the front stoop to sit. Your neighbors will think you've gone plumb crazy, but just remind them that a caring community with a sidewalk in view is built one friendly howdy-do at a time. And second, the second challenge, regardless of whether you live on a sidewalk that is used to go somewhere or simply circle your subdivision, I challenge you to walk on it. Those who came before us knew what our cardiologists have been lecturing us for decades. If you don't use that heart muscle, you're going to lose it. But if your dog is walking with you, please, please be sure to pick up after it. Now, thirdly, I challenge you, if you are able to ride public transit 2 times this year, our almost total dependence on the automobile has emptied our sidewalks, diminished our muscle tone, and here's the catch, limited our freedom. Oh, I know. The car has freed us up to go anywhere we want until the day we can't drive. And then, without an alternative, we become prisoners in our homes at the mercy of friends and family. So if you respond to my challenge to ride transit 2 times this year, when you step on, whisper quietly to yourself, I'm a little freer. I'm a little freer. Finally, and fourthly, in the face of unprecedented pollution and global climate change and microplastics in most of our worldwide water, including our ocean, let's make a hero of the alley junk man who first taught us to recycle and find strength in the knowledge that this is not the first time our community has been called upon to pull together for a common purpose. So I have challenged you, after looking at all of the changes since the 1940s and the early 1950s, to do 4 things. Sit out, walk the sidewalk, ride transit, and recycle, and be sensitive to our nature and its challenges. Now, through so much change, the way things were in the old neighborhood in the 1940s and early 50s is almost totally lost, except for a few enduring memories. Perhaps the best we can do is to fight isolation and discover in our own lives those enduring community values that were nurtured there. And there were some, despite the darker times. So, oh, how soon we forget life in the old city neighborhood just after World War II. Thank you very much.
So if anyone has any questions, there are a few questions in the chat.
Oh, really? Sure. Good.
So one question is, what do you believe will be the most profound forgot in a similar presentation 100 years from now?
Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. It will be, I suspect we will have totally transcended what we know predictably, not predictably, as the cyber world. There will be succeeding generations, and people will talk about laptops and desktops and major computer systems will be a faded and faint memory. That would be my guess.
Yeah, so one of the guests, she said, I think the profound forgot will be the use of DVD players and less farmland. Farmland is already turning into more residential areas.
Oh, yes. Yeah, what's happening is, I think, in addition to what we call urban sprawl or suburbanization, and that's happening in every community in the United States. But even more importantly, The notion in Kentucky, for instance, of a 250-acre farm or a 200-acre farm, a single family operator with perhaps some help, that is fading rapidly because of the power of commuting by automobile. Many 250-acre farms, 10 miles, 20 miles, 30 miles, 40 miles from a city, or even from the county seat town, are now being transformed into 2 and 3 acre plots. And so the notion of a family farm, well, and that's not even talking about what we call the conglomeration of land by what we would call industrial farmers. And that's another dynamic entirely. But yes, I agree. The diminution and the threatened disappearance of farmland. Now, occasionally you'll find young folks doing community gardens, community farming, and registering people for that kind of thing, which is a positive thing, bringing production, agriculture production, closer to individuals and the families. But I don't see that as the major trend.
Yeah. And it was asked, where was the first area in town to lose car lines?
Oh, streetcar lines or bus lines. Well, streetcar lines began declining in the 1930s as we began coming out of the harsher days. But streetcar lines continued through World War II. But then with the transcendence of commuting by automobile, they started declining rapidly. So all the streetcars in Louisville are gone, for instance, by 1948, replaced first by some rubber-tired buses, inflated tired buses, kind of big. Oh, and they were also operated by a trolley extension above. They were electric buses. But so which was the first? I think the easiest answer is that streetcar lines and a suburban commuter line in our community called the interurban, they were beginning to die in the mid to late 1930s.
Another question. What do you believe we should try to hold on to that is present now?
I think awareness. We are more deeply aware of being sensitive to marginalized people. Yes, I think you can overreact to that, but I hope that in an enduring way, we can continue to be especially sensitive to marginalized people, people who for decades and generations have not had the same opportunities, the same possibilities in their life. And I'm hoping that to the extent that we are struggling to nurture that is something we can continue into the future.
All righty. And you took a few people down memory lane.
Yeah.
And we have Jake.
That's a personal note. I know that person. Yes, I most certainly will.
Let's see. And thank you so much for your thoughtful presentation, Mr.
Well, I'm glad to do it. And the talk struggles, of course, with being what Neil Simon, the playwright, indulged himself in multiple plays and many movies, which is kind of a nostalgic trip about family and neighborhood. I tried to make this talk substantially more than that, to try to put my finger on some enduring values, but at the same time, recognizing the warts of what I do not for a moment suggest were the good old days, certainly not for a whole lot of people. So I tried to balance that. But it is, to some extent, for me, a person who was born in 1939, a trip down memory lane. But I think it is important, and this is the last thing I'll say, for those folks who are working with people and who have family members who are 75 years of age or older, I am attempting to describe a substantial worldview for those folks you know and who are related to, who were raised in a community of size, as to what their community and neighborhood and home and personal life was framed by. And that's obviously a goal that I hoped in giving this talk.
All right. It was awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Owen.
Thank you.
So again, if you can, please fill out the survey that you received in your email. And we'll love to get your feedback and hear how you liked or enjoyed Dr. Owen's presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and close the room. Everyone have a great day, and thank you for joining.
Take care.
It was great. I loved it. I like hearing about,
Do you have
back in the day.
Do you have older family?
I do, my grandma, but she really don't talk much about like her time growing up. I think it was, a few instances with racism and things like that. So she really didn't talk much about it. And I know with my mom, she's the oldest and she's 62 now. They experienced it also. They were the first family to move into a white neighborhood.
Oh, really? Where was that?
In Shively.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And they had a lot of problems with that.
Yeah. So where was your grandmother raised?
In the West End. So they lived, I want to say, like close to like Cedar. In that area.
Yeah. Upper Russell neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
But what's now the Russell neighborhood?
It was like a alley. I know the house isn't there anymore.
Oh, yeah.
It was more like an alley that they
Well,
lived in.
that's was frequently, especially in Russell. I think that happened also in Portland some. And a few cases I know of in the Highlands, interestingly enough, Baxter and Broadway. There's still some houses in the alley.
Hell,
We gotta leave in the meeting for all.
I did that.
Yes.
We weren't completely out.
It's not letting me do it.
Let's try again. Let me see if I can.